Vier, Phi, Lofoten, Fram. This cruise on the Hurtigruten ferry Kong Harald would cover nearly 1,300 miles and more than 30 ports from Bergen in the south of Norway to Kirkenes on the Russian border. Nearly half the trip would be north of the Arctic Circle, which is shown by the dotted line on the map. At North Cape we would be slightly above 71 degrees north. We flew from Heathrow after a comfortable coach trip from Southampton and a rather chaotic check-in at Heathrow. Soon we were above the clouds and stayed there in the sunshine until we started to descend into Bergen. Emerging from the clouds we saw many islands. After landing we found the coach that took us to the Clarion Hotel Admiral in heavy rain. After a day's travelling, we were content to enjoy our first experience of excellent Norwegian cuisine and just observe the old town and the harbour from the hotel. The next morning, despite it being a grey day with a rather low cloud base, we decided to go up the funicular railway to view Bergen from above. The trip up was quite an experience, but initially the view of the town was most disappointing. However, we waited in the restaurant, during which time there was a 1-minute silence in memory of the poor people killed in Oslo a week earlier, and eventually the weather cleared sufficiently for us to see quite a lot of the surrounding area. Once we were back down in the town, we walked along the old quayside and explored the Bryggen, one of the oldest parts of Bergen that has been designated as a World Heritage Site. On the way back to the hotel we passed through the market where there was a huge variety of seafood, including these massive king spider crab legs, a delicacy we were to enjoy later on board ship. Kong Harald is 122 metres long, carrying 622 passengers, of which 483 can be accommodated in 227 cabins. The ship has a service speed of 15 knots. As the ship started its northward journey, we enjoyed the first of many excellent buffet meals on board. Overnight, the ship would call at 3 small ports before reaching Ålesund. In the small hours, I woke in the hope of seeing the dawn over the open sea. We were passing through Malloy. The cloud base was very low, but there was just sufficient light to enable a few photographs to be taken. Between Malloy and Torvik I knew we would be in the open sea, and I had hoped to see the sunrise. In the end there was thick fog, and I found it interesting comparing the spectral objects I could see with the navionics chart of Norway on my mobile phone. Torvik is a pretty little village, which we reached in the early morning before proceeding on to Ålesund, which was reached just after breakfast. From Ålesund, the ship makes a major detour inland up Storfjord and Sandnesfjord into Grangafjord. This was supposed to be one of the great highlights of the whole voyage, but with a uniform cloud ceiling at about 500 feet, the excursion was bound to be slightly disappointing. As you go deeper into the fjord system, the sides of the fjords get higher and steeper. The waterfalls were magnificent. Seven Sisters waterfalls are matched on the other side of the fjord by the Prince's waterfall. It is said that he was rebuffed by the Seven Sisters and resorted to drink, which is why the shape of the bottle can be seen at the bottom of his waterfall. Throughout the fjord system, houses are perched in the strangest of places. Eventually, we reached the end of Gerangerfjord, where there were already 2 large cruise ships. Here, we disembarked and boarded some coaches. The fact that there were 4 German-speaking coaches, 1 English-French and 1 English-Norwegian coach, gives a good indication of the passenger mix on the ship. We were to spend much of the day in the coaches, rejoining the ship at Molde. Our route would take us high into the hills on a very windy road known as the Trollstigen. Unfortunately, with such a low cloud base, there was very little to be seen except some of the waterfalls and farms close to the road. Eventually, we descended to the village of Eidsdal, where we took the ferry across the fjord to Linge. On the other side, the coach continued back up into the clouds, passing an impressive salmon ladder, and we stopped to inspect an extremely impressive torrent passing through a gorge. An increasing number of the buildings were using turf roofs. Occasionally, we came across patches of snow alongside the road. Eventually, we came to the descent. This ought to have been dramatic, but was seriously affected by the fog. The road descended in a series of startling hairpins, on one of which the coach actually had to reverse a little in order to make the turn. Perhaps it would have been really scary had the visibility been better. Eventually, as we got lower, we could see the last few hairpins leading down to the valley floor. We stopped for a brief cup of tea and a sandwich. The last part of the journey was fairly rural, and there was another ferry crossing before we reached Molde. In Molde, we had a fish supper at a hotel before going down to the quay to see our ship arrive. The southbound Hurtigruten ship Midnattssol was already at the quay. By now, the distinction between day and night was becoming quite blurred. Our next sector would take us up through some very interesting pilotage past Rorvik and across the Arctic Circle, where we would take another excursion before arriving at Buda. Overnight, the ship called at Kristiansund while we were asleep before arriving at Trondheim just after we had enjoyed our buffet breakfast. We didn't go on the excursions in Trondheim, preferring to relax on board and begin to sort out the many photographs that had already been taken. After leaving Trondheim, we started sailing to the north through the leads and began to see the outer Skerries, eventually arriving at the Kungsgård lighthouse. It is a magnificent and historic building. Throughout the trip, we came across a variety of shipping, including bulk carriers and small container feeder ships, and numerous fishing vessels. The scenery was expansive, and we continued to move steadily northwards in protected water sheltered by the outer Skerries. There are innumerable lighthouses on this coast. Many are attractive, like this one on the island of Vagsøy. In this part of the coast, the settlements were more widely separated, but there were an increasing number of fish farms. Eventually, we reached the point where we could see a wide, well-marked channel off to port, and we could even see a cruise ship going by at the end of that channel. It was natural to assume that that is where we would be going. Not a bit of it. The ship charged headlong towards a very narrow gap. This was the Stockesund. Speed was reduced to about 12 knots, but there was very little room on either side, and we could even see the rock wall going down under the ship, under the water. Almost immediately afterwards we passed a village where they must sit in their living rooms waiting for an accident to happen. Then, under a bridge with very little air draft, and at the next lighthouse a sharp turn to port. Looking back, we could see the complex channel. Then the ship speeded up to its cruising speed and continued on its way. An hour or so later, exactly the same thing happened. We charged into a narrow gap and had to make a full rudder turn to port. It was fascinating ship handling. Once again, we sped out to sea, passing villages, Turrells and Skerries. For a third time that afternoon, we headed into another narrow channel, making yet another hard turn to port. This was a rather gentler turn, so the speed reduction was only minimal. Even so, the vessel heeled outwards considerably as she was driven through the turn following the narrow channel. There were two more grand lighthouses before we reached the port of Rorvik, the second of which was a particularly striking structure called Grinna. There was a short stop at Rorvik, where we passed the south-going Hurtigruten ship Nordkapp. After the stopover at Rorvik, the ship sped on through the night while we slept, but we were awake fairly early and in time to see the ship pass the Arctic Circle beacon. Only an hour later, the ship slowed to a halt, and those of us going on the glacier excursion were transferred to a fast catamaran. For nearly an hour, the Cat made its way inland at 18 knots into Hollandsfjorden until the glacier appeared ahead of us. We were able to land, and the shuttle bus took us to a restaurant built on one of the terminal moraines. Although the cloud base was low when we arrived, it lifted a little so that we could see the full extent of the glacier. As we were about to leave, we were treated to the aerial spectacle of a sea eagle being mobbed by seagulls. Half an hour later, the catamaran slowed as we passed the nesting site of some of the sea eagles. One of them even posed for us. It was then a 3.5-hour run to Buda, where we were to rejoin the ship. On the way, we called at a steep-sided island where there was a small harbour. Apparently this is a good place for seeing puffins, although it is rather late in the year for them to be still feeding their young. I did manage to capture a couple at long distance. In warm sunshine, we sped deeper into the Arctic Circle, passing a small rowing boat many miles from any obvious port. Although well into the Arctic Circle, we still had nearly half an hour of the voyage to go. Eventually, we entered the port of Buda, where there was a considerable variety of shipping and quite a large marina. The highlight of the whole trip was the next stage, where we would steam across Vestfjord and transit the Lofoten Islands before going on to Tromsø. Shortly after leaving Bodø, we passed the Landego lighthouse before embarking on a 4-hour crossing of the vast Vestfjord. In the distance to starboard, we could see the Skarholmen lighthouse. Ahead, the long chain of the high Lofoten Islands, still some 30 miles ahead, presented an obvious barrier. Eventually, we worked our way into the little port of Stamsund. We worked our way along the rugged southern coastline of the Lofotens. During the passage, we passed the south-going Hurtigruten ship Polaris before finding our way into the attractive little port of Svalbard. By now, the light was beginning to fade and the sun was very low. It was about 21:30 local time. We made our way through numerous rocky channels, eventually slowing as we approached Trollfjord. The entrance into the fjord seemed impossibly narrow for the 10,000-ton ship. Once inside, there seemed very little room to turn, but the ship managed to spin in its own length. It felt as though you could almost reach out and touch the rocks. This was ship handling of the highest order. The light faded more as we worked our way through the channels with strong tides, which must have made steering the ship quite difficult until we reached the port of Stokmarknes, where there is a Hurtigruten museum, though we did not have time to visit it. It was now well after midnight, and as the ship pushed on further north beyond the Lofotens, we took the opportunity to grab some sleep. Just after breakfast, the Arctic Circle ceremony was held on the open afterdeck. It was quite warm until the ship's captain put 4 ice cubes down the back of my neck. There were 2 more calls at Harsted and Finnsnes, following which we passed under the Gisund Bridge, which connects Norway's second largest island with the mainland, following which we proceeded up the Gisund Sound to Tromsø. The ship spent the morning in the pleasant town of Tromsø, where we had a fascinating couple of hours visiting the Arctic Museum. I took a photo of the polar bear just in case we didn't see any when we got to Svalbard. We were just sitting down to dinner when we left Tromsø. We were now starting on the final leg of our journey round North Cape, calling at numerous isolated and rather stark fishing ports before reaching Kirkenes. The southbound Hurtigruten ship Richard With passed by very close, adding a little excitement to an otherwise straightforward coastal passage to the north. Before turning in for the night, we called at the little village of Skirvoy. Already the buildings were starting to look harsher and much more intended to cope with the long winter. In the small hours we called briefly at Hammerfest, and then, while at sea, we met the next southbound Hurtigruten ship, Nordstjernen. She is the oldest ship in the Hurtigruten fleet and has a distinctly classic look. After passing through Havøysund, we passed up a broad lead with a few houses scattered about. We learned from another Norwegian passenger that these houses stopped being occupied in the 1950s but are preserved as summer homes. Honningsvåg was our next stop. We were slightly surprised to see a traditional ketch moored next to the ferry pier. There was a bus excursion to North Cape, but it was expensive, and in fact North Cape is not the most northerly part of Norway, so we stayed on board. Beyond Honningsvåg, we sailed past some spectacular cliff scenery and past a rock where there were numerous seabirds. The entry into Kjolefjord is spectacular, with a most interesting lighthouse perched on a rock. It must be very difficult to maintain. It was the weekend, so the large inshore fishing fleet was in harbour. Leaving Kjolefjord, the ship sails steadily up towards Nordkinn, which is the most northerly point of Europe. Unfortunately, we passed it during dinner, and I'm not sure which of this group of photographs shows Nordkinn. Mehamn was probably the most northerly port that we touched at 71 north. Considering its exposed location at a high latitude, it was a surprisingly pretty little town, again with a major fishing fleet. By now the houses, though colourful, were basic and had small windows to minimise heat loss. Further round the coast we passed the Sletnes lighthouse, which is the most northerly mainland lighthouse in Europe. It was now late into the evening, and the birds riding on the updraft caused by the ship were lit from below by the sun sitting well down towards the horizon. We had to slow steam for a short while until the next southbound Hurtigruten ship, Trollfjord, left Berlevåg, which we then entered. By the time we reached the Kjolnes lighthouse, the sun was very low on the horizon. Shortly afterwards, we had our only real sunset of the trip. Through the night there were one or two more port calls. Eventually we reached the large harbour of Vadsø in the early morning. This port has a large fish processing plant, fish farms and a very large fishing fleet. From Vadsø it was a short passage to Kirkenes, where we were quickly disembarked into coaches in time for the transfer flight to Svalbard. Because of lack of capacity, we had to fly all the way back to Oslo and wait 7 hours before catching the flight to Svalbard, where we arrived at 11:30 p.m. in broad daylight. We could see our next ship, Fram, steaming slowly through loose ice. Our immediate destination was a hotel in the town of Longyearbyen. We were quite ready to go to bed and get some sleep before embarking on the next phase of our adventure.